Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. It's time to start your gardening week. So let's get to it with 90 minutes of garden talk. I'll be answering your questions, throwing out some great information, I think, on how to harvest your various vegetables today. And as we proceed, by all means, like every week, throw your questions in the comments and I'll get to it if I can. The focus today is the vegetable garden. For many of us moving into summer, this is the time of year that the plants are starting to grow, maybe already reaching the point of harvest for some, but most of the harvest is going to come later in the year, the season, the summer. However you categorize the way you garden, we need to be looking to that end point as the harvest of our crops reach their final stage. So what does that mean? Well, as we look at the harvest, you need to anticipate why it is you're growing that plant, because that will determine when the best time for harvest is. You go to the supermarket and you buy a bell pepper that's green, or you buy a jalapeno pepper that's green. If that's what you like and that's what you are using in your diet, then you harvest the same way. You harvest a bell pepper when it's green, you harvest the jalapeno pepper when it's green. But if you're harvesting later in the season, you'll notice a change in many of the vegetables that we're growing, particularly peppers. If you leave those peppers on the plant, they're going to change to a yellow or an orange or a red or maybe even a purple. And so we'll often pay extra at the store for a red bell pepper. A red bell pepper is just a green bell pepper that's been allowed to stay on the plant. I like to wait till my jalapenos are mostly red. The flavor will change and the heat intensity also changes if you let the fruit ripen on the plant. It's totally up to you. Whether you want a sweeter bell pepper, usually the red bell peppers are sweeter than the green, or whether you want to harvest at an earlier point. You don't necessarily want to take that same approach with other fruits that you're growing. Cucumbers, for instance, we harvest when they're green, we eat them when they're green. If you leave them on the plant, they'll actually turn yellow and maybe even an orange color. But when they get to that yellow and orange point, they become bitter and they become kind of fibrous. And so for a cucumber, you usually don't want to leave it on the plant till it reaches full ripeness. You want to harvest it when it's much younger. You can harvest cucumbers when they're only 2 inches long to 6 inches long, maybe 8 inches long. It depends on the variety. But the nice thing about something like a cucumber is you can harvest it at any point in that growth. Same holds true with peas and beans. You can eat peas and beans when they're still very young, and sometimes they might actually be sweeter when they're young, less particularly the peas. The longer you leave them on, the riper they get, and the more that seed pod is going to become more fibrous, more dense, and the flavor is going to change in those beans and peas. So there's a couple things just to throw it out. Let's go ahead and get to see if there's any questions. Of course, a shout out to Jay and Heidi, our wonderful moderators that are always doing such a wonderful job on a weekly basis. Melissa Martin's wondering, did your asparagus recover this year? I'm in Colorado Springs and my asparagus is just not producing like I hope this year. Also, it's never going to stop raining, or is it ever going to stop raining? I guess that was my own subliminal input. It's never going to stop raining here in Colorado. So my asparagus has mostly recovered. We had some hailstorms last month that devastated the asparagus right about at harvest time for me. And it's actually looking pretty good. Didn't get a harvest this year because so many of the spears were damaged. I didn't want to harvest anything because I'm worried about next year. I do have a few plants in my asparagus bed that would normally have 6 or 8 or 10 spears right now. I was just weeding the bed yesterday, and some of those plants only have 1 or 2 spears going into the summer. And you want to try to have as many spears as you can in each root bundle, because that's what is giving the energy for next year's harvest, next year's plants. So I'm looking at next year. Some of my plants I'm going to have to not harvest again so that they can get a little bit stronger next year. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed. So I didn't lose any asparagus plants, and I think it's recovered pretty well, but I'm not sure how strong they're going to be to enhance the root system for next year. But thanks for asking. Yeah, it's crazy here in Colorado. It's raining right now. It is cold and chilly. I saw that Eli from In the Garden with Eli and Kate is on the stream right now. And you may have seen some of the videos that we're collaborating with as we're comparing our climates and growing tomatoes. Well, it's a complete swap. It's sunny and warm in Scotland right now, and it is cold and rainy here in Colorado. If I'm lucky, the high temperature today will be 54 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 12 degrees Celsius. The sun is not expected to peek out, and it is just a drenching downpour all day long. So it's just craziness. We'll actually see how my garden ends up this year, because I'm used to hot and dry, and we have yet to have a hot and dry day for a couple of months now. So keep your fingers crossed. I'm going to hope for the best. Idaho Gardener, good morning to you. When do I harvest pole beans? My first year growing, and they are growing a foot a day. And so pole beans, it depends on the type of pole bean and why you're growing them. So if you're growing the pole beans to eat as a bean, I like it when they're a little bit young. And so as you look at the pod that develops, it starts off pretty thin and pretty short, and it'll gradually lengthen. And then you can actually see the beans develop inside the pod. They'll actually start bulging out a little bit. For the sweetest and most tender beans, if you're eating the whole pod, I like to harvest when it's still pretty small, still pretty young, just as you start to see that definition of the bean appear in the pod. If you wait until the bulge is clearly defined and you can actually see each individual bean in that pod, they tend to be a little bit tougher, and the pod itself, like I had mentioned earlier, tends to be a little more fibrous. If you're growing the pole beans for the purpose of the bean, like a pinto bean that might be a vining bean as opposed to a bush pinto bean, for instance, then that's a case where you would want to leave it on the plant, the pods, leave on the plant until they're fully mature and they start to turn brown, because you're saving that pinto bean as a dried bean for the future. But you can also eat pinto beans or any type of pole beans long before they reach that point of full maturity and drying. So if it's something new and like you say, the first year growing, I would suggest go ahead and harvest some on a regular basis. So harvest some when the pods are just a couple inches long. They taste really good in like a stir fry. Wait a week, harvest some more, maybe steam those, wait another week, harvest those. And so try eating them at different stages and with different cooking methods until you find your sweet spot. I tend to like them more tender and younger, and I know others probably like them when they're much more mature. And so experiment a little bit. I talk often about experimenting with the plants you choose to put in your garden and experimenting with the methods of gardening. You can experiment with the harvest in your gardening as well. Harvesting, particularly a plant like a bean plant, pole beans tend to produce over a long period of time. So you can harvest some of those earlier beans and try them one way, and then try other beans as they emerge with a different recipe. And that's really the best way to try to figure out which you prefer and what is the best harvest method for you. And so as we're talking harvesting today, it really does come down to what's the best method for you, because there are many plants that we're growing that we might have agreement on. Tomatoes, for instance. Most of us want that nice, ripe tomato. And to get that nice, ripe tomato, you usually look at the color. But there are so many varieties out there that the color may not be the best way to figure out how to harvest the tomato. Not all tomatoes are red or orange or yellow, whichever color you're growing. Some are green. I grew a green zebra tomato a few years back, and it is green when it's fully ripe. So you can't always gauge a tomato on its color. If you gently squeeze the tomato, it should be firm, but it gives a little bit. It's beginning to soften. And if you grab the potato and tug against the plant, if it comes off, it's fully ripe. If you try to tug that tomato off the plant and it won't give, then it's not fully ripe yet. So I look at the color, I feel the firmness, and then I give it a little bit of tug, and particularly with my cherry tomatoes later in the season when they are filling the plant and fully ripe, I'll go in to pull off a cherry tomato, and just my hand brushing against the other tomatoes will cause them to fall to the ground. That's one way to know when they're ripe. But not everybody is growing tomatoes for that nice ripe tomato. Green tomatoes is an option. You can harvest your tomatoes when they're green and use them in many recipes. The traditional fried green tomatoes in the southern United States is a recipe that I know gardeners who grow tomatoes for that reason. They're harvesting most, if not all, their tomatoes green because that's the way they like to fix them. Same as I was talking about with the pole beans. When you find that perfect point of harvest, because that's how you eat that crop, then that's when you harvest. Whether it's something I suggest for the ripeness of the red bell pepper or the ripeness of that juicy tomato, that may not match. So don't feel like you have to force yourself to harvest later than you would prefer. Go ahead and harvest early. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And thank you, Jay, on top of things, with that link to the collaboration video that I did with Eli and Kate. That's wonderful. It's one of those things that the videos we're doing are a lot of fun, and I know a lot of you really like those videos. So there will be more to come. I'm definitely looking forward to it. And so that's one of those things that I anticipate as I program out my videos for the future. I'm trying to figure out when the next video is going to be and what we're going to do. And it may actually end up being completely different. If my weather never warms up, my season could be totally different. But it looks like in about a week, maybe week and a half, I should actually start getting some warmer temperatures. So keep your fingers crossed. Wormulus is asking, cabbage harvesting. I swear my cabbage is heading at the slowest rate ever. It's months old, so I don't know. It's just the weather, nutrients crowding, etc., that led to slowness. And so a lot of it depends on the cabbage. And so for most leaf crops, spinach, lettuce, kale, beets, if you like the leaves of beets, and particularly as we talk cabbage, it depends on the variety, of course. I'm growing Napa cabbage right now, and it's actually doing better than it's ever grown before. I'm growing a slow bolt Napa cabbage because last year at this time, my Napa cabbage was already bolting. Well, it's not this year. It actually looks wonderful. And so with these leaf crops, you can approach the harvest a couple different ways. You can peel off the outer leaves and use those on pretty much a daily basis, depending on how much you're growing. Or you can leave it all in place. And so if it's a head cabbage, typically you're going to leave the whole head in place. And then when it reaches the size you want, just chop it off at the ground and harvest the whole head. Napa cabbage is more like a leaf lettuce, where you can eat the individual leaves, or wait till it reaches the size and then chop it off and take the whole head of the Napa cabbage inside. The younger plants tend to be a little more tender and a little bit sweeter. So this is one of those things you have to be careful about, because it could be the weather, it could be the soil, it could be overcrowding. There could be lots of reasons why it's not growing as big as you would like it to grow. The older the plant gets, the more the flavor is going to change and the more the texture is going to change. And so at some point with your cabbage, you may want to just go ahead and say, it's old enough. The plant has reached that point that it should be harvested. I'm going to go ahead and harvest it at a smaller size rather than waiting for it to get bigger, because it might not necessarily get bigger. And you can enjoy the flavor while it's still in that young state. Again, with the experimenting, if you've got more than one head of cabbage, go ahead and chop one off and see how the flavor is. And then if it grows, or if it doesn't grow but a couple weeks go by, then go ahead and try another head and compare the flavors and see if you've determined that, yeah, you really should harvest it a little bit earlier and you should harvest the whole plant at the same time. It's really hard to say why some plants take so long to reach that point. I've had plants like, well, for radishes, for instance. I had radishes a couple years ago that just were taking forever to grow. And when I finally said, okay, it's time, and I pulled some of them up, they were very, very small roots. And so I don't know if it was too much nitrogen in the soil, which was a possibility for root crops. If the root doesn't develop, it could be nitrogen. They were planted relatively close together, but I also had some really hot temperatures that would affect how they grew. And so if I had pulled some earlier just to test if they were ready, I would have seen that it just wasn't a very good crop. Could have pulled everything, put in new seeds, and gained an extra couple weeks in that bed on whatever seeds I wanted to grow next. So don't feel like you have to follow the guidance on a seed packet, or you don't have to follow the traditional wisdom. If you look at a seed packet, most of them will say days to harvest or days to maturity. Well, that's a general guideline for how long, if the conditions are close to perfect, that plant will take until you harvest it. Well, like for me right now, I've got great plants that are growing. My lettuce and my spinach and my peas and my Napa cabbage are all looking great. But we had such a weird spring with the temperatures being off so much that if I were to follow the days to harvest, it would be way off, because I haven't had perfect weather. I haven't had the conditions that the seed producer would suggest for me growing those plants. And moving forward, the same with my tomatoes. The tomatoes and peppers that I have already put in the ground are growing very slowly because it's so cold and because it's so overcast. And so while my seed packet might say that I can harvest my peppers in 85 days, it's probably going to be closer to 100 days, just because the conditions aren't exactly right. That holds true with all the other things that we're growing, be it cabbage or anything else. Sometimes you just have to guess at what the best harvest point will be. Use that seed packet information as a guide for when you can start testing and maybe start looking to make a decision about harvesting. But ultimately it comes down to you deciding if it's the point to harvest. And a lot of that comes with experience. I know that's one of those things that I would love to give you the magic answer to always harvest carrots on day 87. But it just doesn't work that way. There are so many other factors that really play into it. And so B. Willis is wondering when to harvest a yellow pear tomato. And so this is another good example of, depends on the color that your pear tomato is. Generally, a yellow pear tomato has a really rich yellow color, but there are some out there that actually have a pale yellow color. So it does depend on the variety. But the color change is a really good indicator of when to start thinking about harvest. Most pear tomatoes are actually a firmer tomato than like a big beefsteak tomato. So you can still squeeze it like I mentioned earlier. It should be slightly soft. It should give a little bit, but not much. It's still going to feel pretty firm on the vine. The tug test works pretty well with most tomatoes. So you can do the tug test on the pear tomato and just pull on it. If it pulls off the plant, then it's probably ready. But for me, particularly with smaller tomatoes, I think the best way to determine the point of harvest is to taste them. There's usually enough tomatoes on our plant that if it looks like the color is about right, and if it looks like the size is about right, and especially if you do the tug test and it comes right off, taste it. And if it tastes ripe, if it tastes good, then go ahead and harvest more. If the texture is right, a tomato should have that nice pulpy, juicy texture in your mouth. If you bite in a tomato and it's just hard, then it's not ready yet. It needs more time on. So taste testing is often a great way to determine when to harvest. And so take a look at the picture that's on your pear tomato seed packet if you grew it from seed. And that's also a good indication. Most of the seed packets that we're planting will have a picture, and most of those pictures are taken at about harvest point. And so you can use that as a general guide for when you at least start the process of the harvesting. And so Rob's wondering, hello to you, Rob. Good morning. I have a question about comfrey tea. I brewed a 5-gallon bucket for 2 weeks. When I opened it, there was a SCOBY-like thing floating on top. Is that normal? Yes. And so as it decomposes, it's not going. There's going to be some particles, particularly the leaf particles that will float to the top. And I just peel that top section off, which is made up of little bits of not yet decomposed comfrey, and put that in the compost pile. And then what's left behind is liquid. There will still be particles floating in that liquid. And so you can strain it, leave or take that liquid, and that's what you use as a base for making fertilizer for your plants. And so, yeah, there will be some funky stuff, and it smells pretty bad, of course. You probably noticed that. But it's all that floating plant material that is lighter than water and hasn't broken down yet, hasn't been decomposed by that anaerobic bacteria. And so I do the same thing with any of the other chunks. Some of the stems, for instance, will sink to the bottom. So when you go to harvest your comfrey tea, there will be the bits floating at the top, and then there will be heavier bits that are at the bottom. And that's why I just usually strain the liquid as much as I can just through a mesh strainer and then mix it into a fertilizer. So yeah, perfectly normal. It's different than a SCOBY, like if you were making kombucha or something like that, kombucha. But it's the same basic idea with something growing and floating to the top. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Okay, let's see. Jenny says, we had a 3-week windstorm recently. Everything took a beating. Hard to transplant stuff without covering with fleece, which isn't necessarily practical for every plant. Pondering solutions. And so I'm actually planning to finish the show today talking a little bit about that. But the idea is that you've got to do what's practical for you. And it may mean replanting. It may mean just accepting that what's happened in the garden right now is not ideal, and especially with a windstorm that has damaged some of your plants, they might not recover. And if they do recover, they're probably not going to grow well because of broken stems, lost leaves. And so this is one of those situations. I've talked in the past about a garden I had almost 15 years ago now that I grew 3 times in one season. It was devastated by wind and hail. I replanted. devastated again, I replanted. It wasn't an ideal season, but you do have to look at what the purpose is for your garden. And if it is something that you can replant, and for most of us in the beginning of June here, almost the middle of June, there is still time to start plants from seed, or to go to the local nursery or garden center where you might actually be able to start getting things on a clearance sale and put those into your garden, rather than trying to recover with the broken plants and then move forward with a less than ideal situation. So that's a consideration, and I'll talk more about that as we proceed to the end of the show today. And so Claudia is wondering, I'm not sure when to dig my potatoes up. The plant is still green, but starting to flower. I've been pulling off the flowers. So this is a good indicator, and you're doing exactly what you need to do. When a potato plant starts to flower, it means that the tubers are growing under the ground. And so pluck off those flowers. That's a great idea, because the energy will now go back into the tubers and not be spent growing those flowers, which will turn into seeds and take a lot of energy from the plant. You can harvest now. As soon as those flowers start to appear, you can harvest the potatoes. But it goes back to what I started with. The taste will be the same, like similar to a cucumber, but the size will differ. And so if you leave the potatoes in the ground longer, they will get bigger over that period of time. If you like young potatoes, then you can harvest now. They're going to be quite small. The longer you wait, the bigger they get. As the summer progresses and the plant begins to die back, now it's time to go to full harvest, because as the potato plant turns brown and withers, the tubers are still underground. They're still going to grow minimally until the plant is completely dead. But that's the point that most gardeners harvest their potatoes, because they're not going to get bigger once the plant has died back. So you have a choice between the flowering stage and until the dieback stage. You can harvest potatoes at any point. The longer you wait, the bigger it gets. And so that's really the big determinant in potatoes. And it's the same with carrots. It's the same with beets. It's the same with most root vegetables. You can harvest at any point in their life cycle. It's a question of the size that you're looking for. And so you can harvest little itty bitty tiny carrots, or you can wait until they get long and a little denser. And there will be a flavor difference subtly, but they're edible during that entire stage. And so just consider what it is you're looking for in size, and then use that as a determining factor. Wormula says, does anyone prune their tomato flowers? I'll assume my brandy wine, if all these flowers turn into massive tomatoes, it's going to be a lot for the plant to take on structurally. Yes, that's a good question, because for most of the plants I'm growing, the cherry tomatoes, for instance, they're growing so quickly, and they grow into clusters, and they're just little tomatoes, and they're trellised, and I leave all the flowers in place. But if you're growing a brandy wine, if you're growing a big beefsteak tomato, you're right. It could strain the plant, depending on how you have it trellised. And they don't always grow in clusters, but some varieties do. And so if you're growing those big tomatoes and you see a cluster of 4 or 5, and you anticipate that at full size, that's going to overload the plant, yeah, go ahead and prune off the flowers. Now, I don't know if you can hear the rain. It's really coming down right now. If in a region like mine with hail and wind and these days heavy rain, I don't know if the flower that I prune off is going to be the only one that would have survived. So I typically will wait until the flowers have opened, pollinated themselves, and then closed. And that's the point that I'll typically wait and then decide if I need to prune off the flowers of those really big fruits. I know people that as soon as the flower appears, they thin them out to 2 or 3 per cluster, but I just think it's some of us don't have that good of luck. If I prune off and just leave 2 behind, then at least one of those is going to end up falling off the plant. So yes, you can prune your tomato flowers off depending on the variety and how big they're going to get, but the plants will often self-prune themselves. That's why I say I expect the ones that I leave behind to fall off, because you can't always be assured that the pollination has happened and the plant is going to fully ripen. And I like to give myself a little bit extra time, a little more patience before I prune. Two gals, nice to see you here this morning. This year I'm staggering my planting of pole beans, cucumbers, and such. Had a hard time keeping up with the harvest, so this year hopefully I buy myself more time to preserve. Great idea. Absolutely fantastic idea. If you're growing for the purpose of preservation and you plant all of your plants at the same time and they're all going to be harvested at the same time, it can be overwhelming. And so staggering your planting times so that you get a staggered harvest time is a great idea. It really is a great idea. That's a wonderful idea to pace your garden and to pace yourself and be able to get some of those really good harvests and have time to preserve them. And I'm guilty of not doing that. You know, I get so excited like many gardeners and get the whole garden planted. And there have been many seasons when I couldn't use my harvest and I didn't have time to preserve everything at the ideal point. And so I hate to admit, but like most gardeners, those are the kind of things that end up in our compost pile because we just got overwhelmed at harvest time. So pace yourself, and that's a fantastic idea. Staggering your plantings so that you really can make the best of the harvest and the preservation when you get to that point. And if you haven't thought about it, it's not too late. You can kind of tie that into the concept of succession planting, where you are putting something else in the ground after the first harvest. Well, tie in the harvest with your succession planting plan, and then add that third factor of the food preservation plan, and you can definitely get the garden to its maximum capacity. And so Lily's wondering what causes beets to grow slowly. And so there are a few things. And so beets, we can talk about the root and we can talk about the leaves. And so much of it has to deal with the nutrient levels in the soil, also the temperature that they're growing at, and the density of the soil as well. So most root vegetables like a nice loose soil. If it's too dense, it's going to take longer for that root to develop. And so I've had that problem when the soil wasn't loose enough and it just seemed to take forever for those beets to grow. Whereas you start the same seed in a different bed that's nice and loose, and that root generally is going to grow faster in a looser soil than a denser soil. The nitrogen levels can make a big difference. If you're growing for the purpose of the beet root, too much nitrogen in the soil is going to cause the leaves to grow and the root is not going to grow as big. And so it may seem like it's taking a long time for that beet root to develop. It's because there's a nutrient imbalance and the root may never grow much bigger than whatever it is that you happen to see. I've had beautiful looking beet plants, pull them up, and they've been pretty small. Another consideration is the thinning. Have you thinned out your beets? The beet seed that we actually put into the ground is really not a seed. It's actually a collection of seeds. So it looks like a single seed is like a little fruit pod that might have 3 or 4 or 5 seeds inside of it. So if you put that single structure into the ground, you're going to get 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 beet plants growing from it. Well, now they're all competing for the nutrients and the water and the light. And if you don't go in and thin out the beets when they're growing close together like that, you're going to end up with a smaller beet root as well. And then, of course, if it's too hot, beets like cooler temperatures. And so if it's too hot, the plant's going to be stressed, and it's also not going to grow as quickly. So there's some things that might help you in your search for growing the perfect beet. I wish I would have started my beets. I'm actually planting my beets as a fall crop this year because I want to be doing more of my cucumber and pepper and tomato growing. But right now, with this rain and these cold temperatures, it's ideal for beet growing in the loose soil beds that I have. So call it a missed opportunity. Marianne Odell, hello to you. Yeah, raining here in southern Colorado. It's crazy rain. I've lived here 25 years and I've never seen a June as cold and rainy as it is this year. So I'm beginning to think that I was in Scotland. Maybe too much of Eli and Kate have rubbed off on me. Patty's wondering, I'm growing Maria red potatoes. What do I do when they bloom? Thank you. Oh, okay. I'm trying to catch up with some of the comments, so I think I answered that a little bit earlier. If it all comes down to the size you want and pluck off those flowers, you can harvest now when they're young or wait till they're older and get a full-size potato. Okay. It's so funny to be here talking and listening to that rain. I'm sorry to keep bringing it up, but it's just so abnormal that I'm just not used to hearing rain at this time of day. We actually had thunder this morning too. I'm used to thunderstorms in the afternoon, but to have thunderstorms at 4 o'clock in the morning and to have the rain happening at 9:30 in the morning is just so unusual. And so Jeremy's wondering about growing degree days. And so this is a great idea. And that's one reason why I'm really concerned about my tomatoes and about my peppers. And I'm not as concerned about the cooler temperatures for the plants like the spinach and the lettuce and the Napa cabbage and the peas. And so the genetics of the plants we grow are pre-programmed. And it all starts in the seed. So whether we grow a seed into a plant and then transplant that or put the seed directly in the garden, the genetics of that plant are already determined by the seed we put into the ground. And so this does tie into the days to harvest or days to maturity that I talked about earlier, where if the conditions are ideal, you can expect that it will take that long for the plant to reach harvest. Well, much of that, depending on the plant, comes down to the temperature and often the amount of light that those plants are receiving. And so if that's disrupted by rainy, overcast, cool days, it affects how long that plant will take to grow to reach the harvest point, or if it's going to be stunted, or if you're even going to get a harvest at all. And so this is one of those things that I suggest you do a search for and maybe learn a little bit more about the growing degree days that the plants require to reach the point that they're going to flower and then pollinate and then reach the plant for that fruit to fully develop. And it's one reason why some of us can grow some plants and others can't, because of the requirements that the plant needs based on the temperature. I talked in an earlier video about onions. Onions fall into the light category, where you've got your variety that you choose based on whether the sun is a short day or a long day type of onion. The heat factor also comes into play for some plants like okra. That's one reason why I just have such a difficult time here in Colorado growing okra. And sweet potatoes can also be one of those where if you just don't get enough hot days, you're not going to have as good a harvest as those who are growing okra and sweet potato in the U.S. South. They have those days of hot warm temperatures. And that also warms the soil, which becomes a factor in how well the plant is going to do. I've got sweet potato slips on my table right now waiting to go in the ground. And it's just too cold. The soil is just too cold for me to put those plants in, but I'm worried about the heat that I'm going to have over the course of my growing season. And so that's one factor. All of those factors play into how well a plant is going to do. And if you are used to growing something and it does really well, and then you have a season that it's just off because it's too overcast or it's cool and you don't get the harvest that you've always had before, it could be that the plant just didn't get enough warm days for it to produce at the level that you've been used to. Von Dykstra, thank you so much for that super chat. Just harvested turnips for the first time. Only one variety, yet some were delicious and some had a strong flavor that didn't taste good. Any tips for good varieties and or when to harvest? So I grow the purple top turnip. I'm actually not growing this year. This is the first year I haven't grown turnips in quite a while. And so I've had a lot of success with purple top turnips here in Colorado. I also grew a variety, it's like Snowball or Snow something, an all white turnip. And I prefer the purple top instead. A loose soil, like I was talking about earlier with most root crops, as loose and nutrient-rich soil as you can. But heat is also a factor. And so it's probably hard to tell after you've harvested, but turnips like the cooler conditions. And so the turnips that were in the front that were exposed to full sun might be the ones that didn't taste as good. And the turnips behind those might have been shaded a little bit, and that's why those might be a little bit sweeter and a little bit better tasting. And so if you're growing, again, the carrots and the beetroots and the turnips, a lot of those plants, if they're exposed to the really high heat of summer, or even just extreme temperatures, high wind, something that's going to stress the plant, that's going to affect the flavor of that root. And so putting some shade cloth over those plants when you have those kind of conditions can make a difference. And harvest time can also make a difference. Generally, you want to harvest most of your vegetables early in the morning. The starches that are developed in the plant over the course of the day will turn into sugar overnight. That's a basic process that most plants follow. And so the plant is going to have the most sugars. It's going to also absorb the soil moisture overnight. And so it'll tend to be have more water in the fruit, more moist. And that's generally a good time to harvest. So if you harvest your turnips, even while you're harvesting, the flavor might be changing depending on the time of day that you're starting to harvest. So if you're starting to harvest early and then you come back later in the day and harvest some more, you can expect that there might be a taste difference in those plants from just a few hours of variation of the harvest time. So there's a couple ideas for the turnips. I hope that helps. Turnips are also another one of those that you can harvest young. If you leave them in the ground too long, they'll get more fibrous, and the flavor will also change as well. So as you grow turnips in the future, try making a couple harvests. Again, the younger ones versus the older ones, and then make that comparison. And you might recognize that a young turnip harvested early in the morning in a bed that's loose with nutrient-rich soil and that has been shaded might be the best one of all. And so that's kind of the approach I take when I'm growing those kind of root crops in particular. And so Sally says, here comes the rain again. Yeah, the animals out there I'm a bit concerned with. My neighbor has the chickens. I haven't seen the chickens out this morning. I think it's time for them to stay inside. And we've got thunder now. This is just crazy. Hi, Jay. Any tips for dealing with very angry nesting bird that's attacking me Oh, sorry to hear that. Hitting a head and shoulders. I've not been able to be in the yard longer than 30 seconds in 3 weeks. Well, I think you hit on the key. It's a nesting bird. And so one of the things you might be able to take a few minutes to look at is, when is it going out to get food for the babies? And so I've seen this. My birdhouses have had the birds in them in the recent weeks. And there's usually, from the time I'm out in the garden, that they are actively feeding. And so the bird is actively going out, finding the food. And if you're interfering with that process, especially if it's near where they're nesting, they're going to run you off. But later in the day, even though it might be a little bit hotter, might be a little more uncomfortable for you, they might be less likely to run you off. And so the time of day is one of those factors maybe you can play with a little bit. Hopefully it's only a short-term problem, because once the fledglings get a little bit bigger, they're not going to need as much protection, and the mother and father are off getting their own food. And so hopefully it's not going to be that big a problem. And if it's been going on for 3 weeks, I'm guessing it's probably getting close to the end. So try staggering your time that you're going out there. Maybe start off in another area away from the nesting if you can, and they get used to you. And then as you work your way to the nesting area, they might not feel as threatened. I've seen that problem before, where if I walk from my house past the birdhouse, the birds freak out and fly away. If I go to the back of my garden and then walk towards my house, they're less likely to fly away. In fact, I've actually gotten pretty close to them without them causing any issues with me or me to them. And it's because of the familiarity, I think. CJ Don, how long in the growing time should I expect good root development? I have long season ones that don't seem to be progressing. Am I being too patient? So it depends on the plant. Most plants are going to develop their roots early in their life cycle, and then they're going to put their energy into the plant, and then the energy will go into the flower and the fruit production. Once the flower and the fruit production starts, there's not nearly as much root development that's happening. Now, that same process is holding true for the carrots and the beets and all the other root vegetables that we're growing. They're going to put the bulk of their time and energy into that root development. And then when it's right for the life cycle of that plant, the root really isn't going to grow much anymore, but the plant will start growing. And so I wouldn't worry about being too patient, because there really isn't much you can do in speeding up the plant's growth, unless you want to expose it to some of that high wind, high temperature conditions that will cause bolting. Because when the bolting happens, when it sends up the flower stalk and the flowers and the seeds start developing, now the roots aren't growing anymore at that point either. And so patience really is about all you can do, but it depends on the plant, and it depends on your weather, and it depends on the temperature as to how fast that root development is really going to take. And so just be aware of that. I like the idea of patience in the garden. It's sometimes so hard to have the patience that we really do need. And most of the time, the things we think we can do for our plants really are minimal. And so we just kind of have to, if you've done all the prep work, if you've got your soil ready and you've got your beds ready and everything is in place, then just let it happen. You've done all the prep work ahead of time. And so go ahead and let the plant grow at the pace it's comfortable with based on the conditions that you've set up for it. And things should be pretty good from that point on. Garden State Gardener. Hello, Joe. I don't know if you saw it, but if you haven't seen it, go to Garden State Gardener's channel. I was on his Sunday Fun Day show last night, and we had a good time together with Danny. So I enjoyed that, and I appreciate you giving that contribution to my channel. So check out Garden State Gardener's channel, and you can see what we were talking about last night. And yeah, check out his live stream on Sunday nights here in the US for some really good gardening conversation. And he always has a giveaway of some type or another. Nell String Nursery, hello to you. Thank you so much for that super chat. Thank you, Gardener Scott. Been learning several things about gardening. That's fantastic. I think we should all learn something every day on gardening. Believe it or not, I still learn every day when it comes to either doing something in the garden or doing research on a gardening topic. So I appreciate that contribution. Thank you so much. And I'm glad you're learning. That's one of the things that if I can help you out, all of you, in just a little way, then my job is done. And it definitely makes me feel better as we all move forward trying to figure out what's going on. Sonia's saying, I'm in my second year of Kiowa raspberries. I've been told they produce on 2-year-old canes, but my new growth is outrageous. I'm trying to root the new growth by burying parts of it. Am I doing right? And so possibly. And so when you bury a cane, and this is a pretty regular propagation method for brambles like blackberries as well, is you take the cane, you bend it down to the ground, you anchor it like with a garden staple, and where it is in contact with the ground, new roots can grow and you can get a new plant to grow. That is an effective propagation method. The issue, however, is for a lot of brambles, 2 years old, that's the point that it is starting to fruit. And so if you're burying a 2-year-old cane, you might not get the root development. It may be too old in its life cycle. It's sending all of its energy to the flowers and the fruit, or the plant is done for. And so even if it does root, the cane on the other side of the root is an old cane and may not produce for you as well. So it's usually better to start with a younger cane, like at the 1-year point. You get that root, now you dig up the plant, and the next year you still have a full year of growth cycle, normal growth in that plant to then set the flowers and the fruit. And so I'm not sure about the Kiowa. I haven't grown the Kiowa raspberries as to whether they fruit on the prima cane or the flora cane, whether it's a first year or second year. So it sounds like they're going to be fruiting on the flora canes in that second year. And it's another one of those it's great that the growth is really well, but I find it easier for my raspberries to just go ahead and dig up some of those plants that are popping up around the edges of the raspberry patch. The blackberries that may not spread as quickly are ones that are ideal for layering in the ground like that. But most raspberries are going to spread pretty easily. And so it takes a year for you to bury the cane, for it to root, for you to transplant it, and then for that plant to grow. Whereas if you just dig up a plant that's already growing at the edges of your patch, I find that to be a little easier method of propagation. In fact, I just did that this last week, dug up a bunch of my raspberry plants that were moving out too far and planted them into another area of my garden. With this rain, it's actually ideal for those to take off. So keeping my fingers crossed about that. That should actually work pretty well. Growing roots in agriculture. Nice to see you back. I'm growing potato mint for the second year. Have you ever heard of this plant? It's an amazing producer that produces hundreds of mini potatoes. I haven't heard of that plant, but good for you. I'll have to look into that. It's one of those things. Emmanuel's got some good stuff on the Growing Roots in Agriculture channel. So I'm guessing you're going to probably make or have already made a video on that. So I'll have to go and check that out. But no, I haven't heard about that. And so it sounds like a good idea. If you like those mini potatoes, go ahead and go for it. And I like fingerling potatoes. I grow a purple fingerling potato because I like the smaller ones as well. Joanne Dawson, thank you for that super sticker contribution. I really appreciate it. Nice to have you here today. Thanks so much. And so Gardens Happen says, I've heard of potato mint. And so I'll have to look into that. That's something that I'm not aware of, but Joe Dixon is on top of it with a link. So thanks for that. I'll click on that link when the show is over and give that a look, because that's one of those things that, like we were talking about learning from gardening, if you can learn something every day, and for me, it might be the potato mint is the thing that I'm learning today. So it's funny what topics pop up and what we find out about the gardening of others. That's what's so awesome about this show. I want to go ahead, since we're talking about growing and harvesting in different gardens, and this is a garden from Don Hessel. And I really like this because I often show the pictures in the background of the full garden with the fences and all the beds and the pathways. But Dawn and her husband decided they didn't want the raised beds in their backyard lawn area. And so they grow in containers. And you can see they've got their green stock. They've got a whole bunch of plants on their deck area in these long troughs right here at the bottom on their patio. They've got sweet potatoes growing. And so don't think that if you don't have the big garden like you see in my videos, that you have to limit yourself with what you can grow. You can grow just about any vegetable that the rest of us are growing in a raised bed. You can grow that in a container. You can use troughs, you can use the green stalks, you can use pots that are resting on the ground, you can use pots that are in pot stands. This is a garden. And I suspect that people who aren't gardeners would look at this collection of pots and not think of it as a garden. But anytime you have a collection of plants growing, it's a garden. If you're taking care of those plants, you're a gardener. And so it's assumed by many people that you can only grow flowers in pots. Oh, no, not at all. You can grow all kinds of vegetables and fruits in your pots. And so I enjoyed getting this photo from Don, and it gives me the opportunity to talk about container growing. I'm not sure if this is garlic or onions. Looks like onions in that pot, but you can see there's sweet potatoes, there's onions, there's all kinds of other plants growing in the background, some on little trellises. And so don't limit yourself to how you look at gardening and thinking about what you can't do because you don't have the right kind of bed. Get out there and do some container gardening just on your patio and deck. And you can still have your lawn or whatever you're using the rest of your yard for and still be able to harvest. That's one reason why I really like my green stock just outside my kitchen door, because I can just walk out and pluck off whatever it is I need and then walk right back. Container gardening, especially with the green stock, is such an easy way to get an easy harvest. I've got one of my green stock towers with nothing but basil this year. And I've already been harvesting some of the basil leaves, just popping out, grabbing some basil and popping back into the kitchen. So a close garden to your back door may mean it's containers, and Don has a good example of this. So I appreciate that you shared that, and I appreciate you, Jay, for doing the reminder. If you would like to have the background image on this live stream show, send it to me to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com. Now, I do need a few things from you. It should be in horizontal mode in the landscape selection on your camera or your phone. Do send me the file of the photo. I've had a few images that have been sent to me recently that the file size was just too small, and it was embedded in the email, and I tried to put it up in the background, and you can see this is a nice clear image. If the file size is too small, it is just so pixelated and so grainy that it doesn't look good as a background. And so I appreciate all the photos that I receive, but some of them I just can't use because the photo size is too small and it just doesn't work well. And I've also received photos that are vertical in portrait mode, and it just doesn't work the same way. When I try to use it as the background, I have to crop it, and I can't always get a good image horizontally with a photo that is vertical. And so make it in landscape mode with the full file size, if you will, and that gives me better opportunity to use it as a background. And then of course, allow me to use it. If you don't specifically tell me that you are giving me permission to use it, then I won't. I'll assume that you were just sharing it with me as an image of your garden, and I won't plaster it up for thousands of people to see. And so I've had some great photos from people, but they didn't say that I could use it publicly, so I don't. And so thank you, Jay, for posting that, because I do need more background photos, especially as your gardens are looking great. So send me your images, and as long as, like Jay says, a large attachment, landscape position, a written permission, and then yeah, tell me a story about it. Like today with Don telling me that these troughs were the sweet potatoes, and actually planning to grow some sweet potatoes in the greenstock tower. And then the idea that they're not putting raised beds, that all came from the email that Don shared with me. So I'm always looking forward to seeing other gardens and seeing what you have to offer out there to share with the rest of us. So please, by all means, help us out with that. And okay, I'm scrolling down now. Liz G is saying, I transplanted celeriac, but I heard I should have sown the seeds outside. Have I messed up getting a harvest? Probably not. That's one of those plants that doesn't always transplant well, but it could. And if you've got time and if you still got seeds, go ahead and throw some seeds in that same bed and they'll probably recover okay. You just have to wait and see. If they were transplanted well, then you might be able to get a good plant that you can harvest. But it's always one of those things that if you have doubts about how well your garden is doing, about whether you transplanted correctly, about the spot you chose, if there's still time in your season, go ahead and start over. Go ahead and start seeds in a different spot or near the ones that you suspect might not do as well, and you can still get that harvest and chalk it up to a lesson learned as to whether you're going to be transplanting that in the future. That is one of those plants that usually does well from seed, and I think most people do try to do it from seed. So it's worth a try, but I'll keep my fingers crossed for you. So thank you, Growing Roots and Agriculture. Amazing live stream. I appreciate that input, and always nice to have you here. Looks like Brian is headed out. See you next week, Brian. Always nice to have you here as well. And Brian's a regular that's on the show an awful lot to participate, so that's fantastic. Shandy's Garden broadcasts tiny seed into a small container, even if it's a little restaurant container or styrofoam tray. Then I take out the strongest ones to give them their own little space in a cell tray later. Yeah, great idea. Great way to reuse some of the things we wouldn't normally use. And container gardening, exactly that. It is one of those things that can start in egg cartons, real small containers, and then you transplant stronger ones at each stage, and it actually works out pretty well. So appreciate that suggestion. Some good conversations going back and forth. Nice to see this. Gina saying potato mint grows in hot, dry climates, best in zones 9 to 11. Interesting. That's good to know. Since some of us, it's a new topic of discussion. Sally's wondering, my sweet potato leaves are turning yellow. Do you think it's all the rain, or do I need to use shade cloth, or maybe it's a combo issue? My guess it's the rain. All of the plants, well, most of the plants that are growing out in my garden right now, the lower leaves are yellowing because it's just been so rainy and the soil has been so consistently wet and there hasn't been as much sun. It's normal for plant leaves to yellow. Now, what you should be looking at is the overall plant. So those lower leaves on the plant will be the first to yellow, and that's perfectly normal. And on sweet potatoes, it's the same thing. You can expect yellowing leaves. But the new growth and little farther along on the stem or on the vine should be green. The rest of the plant should look healthy. And gradually the plant will recover, assuming the rain ever stops. But in saturated conditions, you can expect the yellowing of leaves. And so you might actually consider, rather than shade cloth, because my guess is that the sun drying out the soil is a better idea, that the sweet potatoes are going to need some heat and drier conditions. Instead of the shade cloth, maybe consider putting plastic or something over just to keep the rain off if it continues. And once the soil begins to dry a bit, you should see less of the yellowing leaves, if that is indeed the problem. If the whole plant is turning yellow, it could be other factors. It could be nutrient issues. It could be herbicide contamination. It could be a pest that ate the roots and killed the plant. And so as long as it's just lower leaves yellowing, that's normal. But it could be a lot of other things that is worse if the whole plant is yellow. So consider some of those factors. Sherry's saying, I found that one of the best tools in my garden is my journal. Totally agree. It has pages of graph paper indicating when I started seeds, when they were transplanted out, and any successes. Absolutely. And I've said this many times before. I think garden journals are a very important part of the gardening process. And especially talking about harvesting like we do today. The harvest is variable based on the conditions that we've been talking about. But it's one of those things that you can get an idea, especially if you see patterns in your weather and if your climate stays relatively consistent. If the seed packet says that it's 85 days to harvest, but your garden journal says it's 90 days to harvest from one year to the next, now you know how long that plant is going to take to grow in your garden. And so you can also put it in your journal when to plan the harvest. So you put the seeds in the ground, you let the plant grow. You can go to your calendar and write on the calendar your anticipated harvest date based on the data that you've been collecting and putting into your garden journal. So yeah, that is definitely one of the best tools that you can be using, is to track what's happening in your garden. Because remember, a lot of what I say, a lot of what the seed packets say, it's a guideline, and it's a general guideline for many gardeners. What works best for you in your specific garden is what you figure out based on the experience and based on the data points you keep in your journal. So wonderful, wonderful idea. Growing roots to in agriculture, thanks to you and many others, I'm less than 30 subs away from hitting 4,000. That's fantastic. I couldn't have done it without you and the support of others. Well, thank you, Emmanuel. I'm so glad that 4,000 is a nice number to hit. So I'm guessing that by the end of the week, you'll be over 4,000, and that's fantastic. Lots and lots of videos on that channel and lots of good topics in a much warmer region than mine. So you'll see some things growing there that you might not necessarily see in my garden, because we definitely are growing different things at different times. And so Frederick Von Kohl's wondering, why are my tomatoes small, some of them? So it might depend on the variety and the size of the tomato. Often, if you're not paying attention to what the package says, I've seen packages, seed packages, that show the nice, what looks to be big, beautiful red tomato, and then you look at the back in the fine print, and it says produces a 2-inch fruit, which is a relatively small tomato. And so you can't always go by the photo as to what the size is going to be. But if it says it's going to be a bigger tomato and it isn't growing that big, temperature is often a factor, especially if it's cooler than normal, then that can impact how big the fruit is going to grow because it's growing at a slower rate. And then the genetics kick in as far as how long it takes to harvest. So it's growing slower, but it's still going to harvest or going to ripen at about the same time. And so you're going to end up with a smaller fruit from that perspective as well. And then also the nutrients will play a factor. If you have an abundance of nitrogen, that's also going to impact the size of the fruit that develops. So there are a few factors that might be involved with that. So take a look, and if all of the fruit is small, then it could be the plant itself. I've seen that in my years as I grow some of the same varieties from one year to the next. Some years I have a plant and the fruit just is bigger on the entire plant. And then there's years that I'll be growing a plant and the fruit is smaller on the entire plant. Genetics will vary from one seed company to another or from one year to the next. And so that's a good opportunity, especially if you're saving seed, that you save the seed of the plants that are doing really well in a particular year. And hopefully you can get the same results in the years ahead. That's one of those things that can really work out well for you if you're moving toward the seed saving point and then only growing the varieties that are doing well in your garden. That's one reason why I like my black Krim, because I've had great success with my black Krim tomatoes, and I've saved the seed from the plants that do the best, and that's what I'm growing every year, and I continue to have good success with those plants. So that's the approach I take. If you're expecting a bigger fruit and you're getting the small fruit, I would probably stay away from those seeds and try to find another source, or maybe abandon it and try a completely different variety as you move into the future. Tim's wondering, if you had a borer pest or a leaf egg pest, do you think running the plants through a chipper shredder would help before putting it in the compost? Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, there's a place near me where I get most of my wood chips, and we have some pests, insect pests, that have devastated the forests here in Colorado. And so at that place I get my wood chips. You can drop off your plants and then they put it through their industrial chipper, and then you can take the wood chips home. And in their literature, they answered this same question. What about those insect pests that could be in that wood? The chipping process destroys the eggs and kills the adults. And so, yes, it can be very effective. Then you put in your compost. Any eggs that might have survived are not going to survive the composting process. So I like that idea, Tim. That is one of those things that if you're trying to get rid of a borer problem, yeah, chip it up and then put it in the compost, and you should be able to pretty much eliminate that issue in the future. Greg's wondering, do you or others have a rule of thumb for picking zucchini or any summer squash in terms of flavor changes with size? Yeah, and so with zucchini and most of the squashes, if I go outside, see my zucchini and say, well, that might be a little small, I'll come back tomorrow. That's a mistake, because you come back the next day and it's grown 3 inches overnight and now it's too big. So a general rule of thumb is, if you're looking at your squashes and it's close to the point of harvest, go ahead and harvest it. It might be a little bit small, but it's still going to taste great. It actually might taste better, because you see this on zucchini. If you let it get into that big Mongo zucchini that weighs 10 pounds, it's going to be fibrous It might be dry. The flavor is not going to be as sweet as it could be if you had harvested it much earlier. So general rule of thumb for most of those kind of plants, the earlier you harvest it, the younger it is, the more flavor it's going to have, the sweeter it's going to be. The longer you wait, the more the flavor is going to be average, and the flesh might be a little dense, and you might not enjoy it as much. So hope that helps, because the flavor will definitely change in time as you allow the squash to continue to grow. Masabi Gal says, I find the more I learn and put in my bag of tricks, the better I can solve problems and cultivate in my own unique garden. Absolutely. It's all about our bag of tricks. You know, I share most of my bag of tricks, but there are some things I do that I really don't share or don't talk often about because it's what works in my garden. And it's the kind of thing that some of those things I might share, someone else would do it and they wouldn't have the same success. That's why I tend to try to be a little more general and broad-based with the tips I give. But if you find that thing that works in your garden, then definitely go for it. And so in my garden, there are certain beds that I grow the same plants in every year because I found that to be the best bed for that plant. And so I really can't tell you which bed is best. I can't say, hey, in my garden, it's the second bed from the left that gives me the best zucchini. So you should grow your zucchini in the second bed from the left. It doesn't work that way. And so, yeah, absolutely. Keep track of what's working in your garden and what's happening for you and do the best with it. So, I didn't see Tony was on the show. So looks like we might have missed him and he went off to work. So if you're still listening on your way to work, Tony, hello to you, and I hope you have a good and a safe day at work. So always nice to have you here on the show. So some talk about Dollar Tree. I'm planning on doing a video about gardening from the dollar stores here in the future. So I'll have to check and see what you guys are doing. Lorenzo Lamas, didn't realize how much we missed watching till the kiddos saw you were on and live and got super excited. Thanks for your advice over the past few years. Burnout, be gone. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Nice to see you back and watching, and I'm so glad that the kids are excited about it as well. So yeah, burnout, be gone. Just like I'm hoping the rain will be gone. And before we came on, I saw so much discussion about so many of you are dry and not getting the rain. And, you know, it's one of those things, be careful what you ask for, because for years now we've been saying we need the rain because we just haven't been getting the rain. Last year was incredibly dry. And now that we've got the rain, we're complaining about the rain because we're just not used to it. And we have to stop ourselves sometimes and say, but it is good. The dry is good, the wet is good. It all depends on how you're using it in your garden and whether it's actually working for you or not. But that's just nature, and you have to roll with it. Wayne says, thank you, Gardener Scott. I'm growing black creme for the second season. The big tomatoes were great. Looking forward to seeing nice plants and the harvest. No pressure, right? Yeah. I hope you have a fantastic harvest with that as well. And so Derek's wondering, as someone who's at work early in the morning, is it better to wait until evening to water the garden? And so better is a relative term. And so if that's the best time for you, then yes, it's better to water in the evening. A lot depends on the weather. And so in the summer for me, the hot days and the dry conditions really causes my soil to dry out quickly. And so for many of my plants, I water in the evening because it helps cool the plants down. It gives them that boost of water from the soil. I use mulch, so hopefully the soil hasn't dried out too much over the course of the day. But then they go into the night in those nice moist conditions. The transpiration is happening, the fruit is gaining some of that water, and then they start the day nice and fresh and healthy and happy, and then I water again in the evening. Now, if you live in a humid environment with a lot of fungal issues, then morning is usually a better time to water because any excess water actually dries over the course of the day. It's not sitting there at night in that cool, moist conditions, and you will have fewer fungal problems. So to say which one is best gets back to your individual garden. Do you live in a dry area? Maybe nighttime watering, and on some days, both morning and evening. But evening tends to work well for me because the plant is going to wilt over the course of the day. I go ahead and water in the evening, it perks right up and it's ready to start the day. But if you live in that wet region, maybe too much water at night could cause some issues. And so depending on where you're at, Derek, if evening is when you can do it, then do it in the evening. And that really becomes, I think, a primary factor in deciding when the best time is for you to actually do your watering. Hello, Greg. Please send me some of your rain. Thanks again for another great chat. So I appreciate that super chat contribution. Yeah, you can have it. My garden is saturated and we're just not used to it. I still would like the afternoon thunderstorms. They're nice without hail, but you can have it. I hope it's heading in your direction and you'll get it soon because I need to get plants in the ground and it's just too cold, just too chilly. And I just am getting so frustrated. I try not to get frustrated in the garden, but I'm getting frustrated because I just can't get the plants in the ground because it's been so cold and wet. So Dan says it's on the way in New Jersey, so I hope it finds its way there. And so what do you do when you have that situation where it's just too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry? Gardens Happen did a video a week or so ago talking about the things that are dying in their garden because it's been so hot and dry. And I've got the complete opposite problem, which I never have. It's just too cold and wet, and things are starting to die. Things are not growing the way they're supposed to grow. I mentioned it earlier in the show, and I think this is an important consideration. First, why are you gardening? Why are you out there devoting your time and energy and money to grow your garden? If there's a very specific goal, can you still meet your goal? If you've got plants dying because it's too hot and dry, or the opposite, can you fix whatever that issue happens to be? Or if it's purely nature and weather, is there some modification you can make to your bed, shade cloth, extra watering in the morning and the evening, maybe choosing a different plant? Are those things that you can do and still have a gardening season? If the reason for the season is to grow food and your season is too short after a certain point, then it might not make sense to start your garden over again. And so if you're growing sweet potatoes, for instance, and sweet potatoes might take 100 days or more to harvest, and you're delayed like I am with these conditions right now, I'm getting to the point that even though I've got my sweet potato slips, I'm probably not going to reach the point of having a sweet potato harvest. So I have a couple choices: to either just toss the slips into the compost pile and save myself a lot of effort and frustration because there just isn't enough time to reach that harvest. Or do I have an alternative? And this is actually what I'm planning on doing. In my grow bags, I'm going to start growing some sweet potatoes. I was planning on growing sweet potatoes in a raised bed, but in a grow bag, I can bring that bag in to a sheltered area if frost threatens too early, which is probably going to happen. And so I can still grow some sweet potatoes, but not the way I planned because I have to roll with the punches that the weather is throwing at me. Is there an opportunity to maybe grow something different? the tomato plants that I'm planning on growing that are sitting in my greenhouse ready to grow, if it is much longer, I'm not going to be able to get those plants in the ground and really have a successful year. So maybe instead of growing the tomatoes in the beds I was planning on growing tomatoes in, I can grow some herbs or some root vegetables or an alternative crop because I'm looking to the harvest. I'm looking to my efforts along the way and trying to determine if it's worth my effort. Now, I love growing, and I've had many years where I grew plants fully knowing that I wasn't going to get a harvest, but I still learned from the process of growing. I still learned about trellising. I still learned about insects. I still learned about watering. So throw that into the mix of your discussion internally as well. Even if you know you're not going to get a harvest, is it worth going through the growing season because of what you can learn from the lessons along the way? And so as we are all confronted with these challenging weather environments that it seems like all of us have a challenge of one type or another, try to figure out why you're gardening and whether you need to modify or not. And I think ultimately, I always say we should enjoy gardening. If it's reached the point that you're not enjoying it, if you are making a video about those harsh conditions and you are saying that it's not fun anymore, then take a break. It's okay to go ahead and step back. And who knows, this year is one of those years for me. I've already got my hail cloth up over my large area. I've got plastic over some of the plants right now, which is unheard of in June, just to try to keep them warm. And if I were to have a hailstorm here in a couple weeks that devastated the plants that I already have in the ground, I think some of those beds, I would just say, okay, I'm done. I'm done. I'll just focus on a smaller garden, smaller beds with plants that I know will survive in the remaining time ahead, and I'll be happy with that. Sometimes you have to scale back your goals when things aren't working right, and that's okay. Take a break. Take a long weekend road trip somewhere. Do whatever you need to do to stay happy with your gardening and to keep that motivation moving forward. And I know it's a bit counterintuitive that sometimes the way to stay happy in gardening is to not grow plants, but when it becomes too frustrating and reaches that point that it's just too much stress, then the answer might be to not grow and to focus your energy on something else. Some of the best construction that I've done in my gardens have been when the plants died, when the weather was terrible. And now I had time that I was going to devote to plants, and instead I devoted that attention to building new raised beds, or to put in pathways, or to build fences to keep the deer out. I've gotten some great projects done when I didn't have to worry about the plants because I just walked away from the plants because of whatever issue had come into play. So think about those factors. Don't walk away from gardening. Just walk away from some plants in a season that tends to be harsher than others, and then come back with a revitalized approach to your gardening, and then you can be ready for whatever happens next, and then start logging those lessons learned and of course those successes along the way. Colorado Bird Nerd, thank you so much. We're so cool here in West Cliff, Colorado too. Learned so much again today. Thank you. Well, thank you for that super chat. It's always so nice to have you here, and I appreciate seeing you every week as well. This is one of those things that you all are so fantastic. And this is another thing when you get to that point that is just so frustrating because the weather isn't cooperating. Well, get into a group and talk gardening with other people. We did our plant sale. I think I mentioned that last week for my garden club plant sale last weekend, a whole week ago in the weekend, and it rained the whole time. it was miserable. We were all in jackets, huddled underneath the tents, but people still came out and bought the plants at the plant sale. And that was so wonderful. There were a dozen, maybe 15 of us from the plant, from our group, from the garden club. We were standing in the rain talking plants, talking gardening while we were cold and soaked. And to see all the other gardeners come, oh, it was fantastic to just forget about the rain, forget about the cold, and just focus on talking with other gardeners who were going through the same painful conditions. Sometimes that can be great therapy. So if it's getting hard, find a gardener to talk to, and my guess is it will seem a little bit easier as you move forward. So I hope it's easy as you move forward. I hope you have a great gardening week. I hope your weather cooperates, and I'll be back next Monday. Same time, same place. We'll talk more gardening because it makes me feel better, and I hope it makes you feel better too. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.